Hello, everyone, and welcome to CogNosco Ascolto, the official scientific podcast of CogNosco Lab. This podcast series highlights our research in cognitive science and artificial intelligence.
Hey there! Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Well, today we're going to be exploring how people perceive the STEM gender gap, specifically on social media.
Interesting.
We've had some really fascinating research for this one,
Oh, yeah.
including an academic paper that uses this really cool method called textual forma mentis networks,
Wow.
or TFMN for short.
Okay.
And essentially it analyzes tweets to map out
Uh-huh.
how people are thinking and feeling about a certain topic.
So like,
almost like reading the collective mind of Twitter.
oh, wow. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Here.
And what's really fascinating about TFMN is that it doesn't just look at individual words.
Okay.
It analyzes the relationships between them.
Oh.
So imagine like you're looking at a sentence diagram, but on a much larger scale where each word is like a node in a network.
Right. So instead of just counting keywords, it's more
like-
about understanding the context and the connections between ideas.
Yeah, like seeing the bigger picture.
Exactly. And here's the really cool part.
Okay.
Each word is also tagged with an emotional label
Whoa.
based on this massive psychological study.
Oh, wow.
So we can see not just what people are saying,
Right.
but the feelings associated with those words,
Yeah.
whether it's joy,
Hmm.
trust, anger, or even anticipation.
That's wild. Okay, so before we jump into like what this research revealed, let's quickly set the scene.
Okay.
You probably already know the basic stats.
Right.
About 30% of females in STEM fields at university level,
Hmm.
only 28% of researchers globally being women.
Yeah, those numbers paint a broad picture.
Right.
But what we're doing here is going deeper,
Yes,
trying to understand how people experience and perceive
exactly.
this gap, especially on social media,
Yeah,
where these discussions are happening all the time.
got it. So this research used over 10,000 tweets
Wow.
from a 2-week period in October 2019,
Okay.
all containing words like science, STEM women,
All right.
and gender gap. And just to be clear, the researchers had proper authorization for this,
Of course.
and we won't be sharing the actual tweets verbatim because of Twitter's policies.
Right. But what's important is that TFMN allows us to go beyond simply quoting tweets.
Okay.
It helps us understand the underlying sentiment and the patterns in how people are talking about the STEM gender gap.
And what did they discover?
Well, the overall sentiment was surprisingly positive.
Really?
The analysis showed that positive words were not only more numerous,
Okay.
but they were also better connected and more central to the conversation than negative ones.
So it wasn't just a few isolated positive comments.
Right.
It was a more pervasive sense of optimism.
Exactly. People seem to be approaching this issue with a sense of hope and a belief that things can change for the better.
That's great.
And this was reflected in the emotional aura.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Emotional aura.
Yeah.
Could you explain that a bit more?
Sure. Think of it as a way to visualize the emotional weight of a word within the network.
Okay.
Words like STEM, gender, and gap all had these positive auras around them.
Okay.
It means they were frequently used in conjunction with words expressing hope, trust, and anticipation.
Interesting. And this positive sentiment even extended to the word student.
Yes,
Uh.
which is intriguing because studies have shown that students themselves
Right.
often have more negative views of STEM.
Really?
It suggests that perhaps those outside the education system have a more optimistic view of the future
Huh.
for the next generation.
That's a good point. It's like people are looking at the progress being made
Right.
and feeling hopeful, even if those on the front lines are still facing challenges.
Precisely. It highlights how public perception can sometimes differ from the lived experiences of those within a particular field.
Okay, so we're seeing a lot of positivity overall,
They are.
but I'm guessing it's not all sunshine and roses.
You're right. The really interesting insights come when we zoom in on specific word clusters.
Okay.
Like the one around woman.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
What was the emotional aura around woman?
It was actually quite mixed.
Oh.
There was a lot of positivity, especially when it came to leadership and recognition.
Okay.
Words like entrepreneur, award leader, and success were all clustered around it.
Mm-hmm.
There was also a strong association with learning and education.
Mm-hmm.
Words like teacher, inspire, and learn were prominent.
So a very empowering image of women in STEM,
Yeah.
but you said it was mixed, right?
Yes. Unfortunately, amidst all that positivity
Yeah.
were some unexpected negative associations.
Like what?
Words like indebted, kill, loan, and cry also appeared in the cluster around woman.
Wow, that's a pretty stark contrast. What could explain that?
This might reflect what's known as stereotype threat.
Okay.
It's this idea that women in STEM often feel pressure to conform to certain stereotypes,
Oh, right.
sacrificing personal qualities to succeed.
Oh, I see.
This can create a sense of isolation and pressure,
Yeah.
which might explain those negative associations.
So even in a discussion filled with positive sentiment, these harmful stereotypes can still lurk beneath the surface.
Exactly. It's a reminder that simply celebrating women's achievements isn't enough.
Right.
We need to address the underlying narratives that perpetuate these harmful stereotypes.
Yeah, and speaking of stereotypes,
Yeah.
the cluster around man also had some interesting revelations.
Oh, yeah. I'm curious to see how that plays out. What did the analysis reveal about the word man? Well, like woman, it was mostly positive.
Okay.
Words like science, passion, and smile appeared frequently.
Okay.
However, there were also links to negative concepts like rape issue and racist.
That seems to suggest an awareness of men's role in these societal problems,
It does.
even within a seemingly neutral field like STEM.
Yes, it points to a recognition of the power dynamics at play.
Okay.
But here's the truly fascinating part.
Okay.
Man was also connected to the word not
Huh.
in relation to words like God, think, make, and consider.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that suggest?
This suggests a pushback against the idea of male superiority in STEM. It challenges the myth that men are inherently better at math or science.
Wow.
It's like people are actively rejecting those traditional narratives.
So it's not just about celebrating women,
Yeah.
it's also about challenging the traditional narratives around men in STEM.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to address these ingrained stereotypes on both sides of the gender divide if we want to achieve true equality.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, what about the gender gap itself?
Yeah.
What was the collective mindset around that phrase?
Interestingly, both gender and gap are fairly neutral words on their own,
Right.
but in this context, they are surrounded by a positive aura.
Really? So even the gap was seen in a positive light.
Yes, it seems that people are approaching the gender gap not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as a problem to be solved.
Okay.
3 key themes emerged around the word gender.
Okay.
The first was respect and consideration,
Okay.
with words like balance,
Uh-huh.
close, consider, and respect appearing frequently. The second was a focus on research and understanding.
Oh.
Words like research, support, future, highlight, and explain were prominent.
So there's a desire to learn more about the issue
Yeah.
and find solutions. What was the third theme?
The third theme was mostly negative,
Okay.
focusing on imbalance and bias, with words like doubt,
Okay.
imbalance, and attack.
I see.
But even these negative associations were often framed in a way that suggested a desire for change.
How so?
For example, words like stereotype, unfounded, break, and tackle
Okay.
were all linked to gender, suggesting a commitment to dismantling harmful ideas.
It's like they're saying, we see the problem, we're not going to ignore it, and we're going to do something about it.
Exactly. It's a powerful example of how language can shape reality.
All right.
By actively discussing and rejecting stereotypes, we can influence perceptions
Yeah.
and hopefully behaviors as well.
That's encouraging. So we've looked at gender, but
Yeah.
what about gap? What kind of future are people envisioning?
The cluster around gap was particularly rich in anticipation, suggesting a forward-looking perspective.
Okay.
2 main focuses emerged.
Right.
The first was overcoming the gap with words like reverse, break, crack, bridge, and reduce appearing frequently.
Okay. And the second?
The second focus was on the economic implications of the gender gap,
Right.
with words like pay, income, and wage, highlighting an awareness of the gender pay gap.
So closing the gap isn't just about equal representation.
Right.
It's also about economic justice.
Absolutely. Addressing pay inequity is a crucial step toward closing the gender gap more broadly.
Right.
It's about creating a system where everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, regardless of gender.
This is also fascinating. We're getting a real sense of how people are thinking and feeling about this issue, and it seems like there's a lot of momentum for change.
It does.
Now, I'm curious to see what the analysis revealed about the word scientist.
Ah, yes. This is where things get really interesting. The cluster around scientist was overwhelmingly positive,
Okay.
linked to ideas of innovation, success, and hard work. But here's the really interesting bit.
Okay.
there weren't any of the typical male-centric stereotypes
Oh, wow.
that we often see in other studies.
So in this context, the image of a scientist is gender neutral.
It seems that way.
That's pretty remarkable. Why do you think that is?
It's likely due to the heightened awareness of gender bias in this specific discussion.
Okay.
People are more conscious of avoiding stereotypes when talking about the gender gap in STEM.
Right.
It could also be because there's a higher presence of actual STEM professionals on Twitter compared to other platforms,
That's interesting.
leading to a more nuanced and informed conversation.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
So overall, the picture that emerges from this analysis is quite positive,
it is.
but with some important complexities thrown in.
Right.
It's like a tapestry with a bright, hopeful pattern,
Yeah,
but woven with some darker threads that we can't afford to ignore.
that's a very apt analogy.
Right.
And it underscores the power of tools like TFMN.
Yeah.
It allows us to look beyond the surface to see the full complexity of how people are thinking and feeling about a topic.
Right. You mentioned earlier that TFMN has some limitations.
Yes. It's important to remember that it uses general emotional labels,
Right.
not individual ones.
Okay.
And it can't always capture the full nuances of language,
Like what?
like sarcasm, for instance.
Yeah.
So it's not a perfect tool,
Right.
but it still provides valuable insights.
Absolutely. Despite its limitations, TFMN offers a fascinating glimpse into the collective mindset
It does.
and how language shapes our perception of reality.
Yeah.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Before we move on, I want to take a moment to reflect on what we've learned so far.
Okay.
It's clear that the public discourse around the STEM gender gap on social media is more nuanced than we might initially think.
Sure.
There's a lot of positivity, a desire for change, and a recognition of the challenges that still exist. But what's really striking is the awareness of unconscious bias and the importance of language in shaping perceptions and driving change. What are your thoughts on this? What stood out to you the most?
Well, what strikes me is how this research challenges some of our assumptions about social media.
Yeah.
You know, we often hear about the negativity and the polarization that can thrive online.
Right.
But this analysis paints a much more hopeful picture, at least when it comes to the STEM gender gap.
Yeah, it's refreshing to see that, right?
It is.
Instead of just being a platform for outrage,
Yeah.
social media can also be a space for thoughtful discussion and a genuine desire for progress.
Absolutely. And the fact that the language around scientists was largely stereotype-free
Oy.
is particularly encouraging.
Yeah.
It suggests that the online community, at least in this context,
Mm-hmm.
is actively challenging traditional gender roles and embracing a more inclusive vision of science.
It makes you wonder if these online conversations are actually ahead of the curve when it comes to breaking down stereotypes.
Yeah.
Could it be that social media is where the real change is happening
Yeah.
and the rest of the world is just playing catch up?
That's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
It certainly seems plausible.
Right.
Social media allows ideas to spread rapidly and for people to connect with others who share their values
Uh-huh.
and perspectives. It can act as a catalyst for shifting societal norms.
It's like a global brainstorming session.
Yeah.
Where people from all walks of life can contribute their ideas and challenge outdated ways of thinking.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to foster these conversations, to create online spaces
Right.
where people feel safe to express themselves and engage in meaningful dialogue.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener?
Yeah.
Well, for starters, you've now got a glimpse into the collective mind of Twitter,
Okay.
specifically on the topic of the STEM gender gap.
And as we've seen, it's a mind that's full of hope,
Mm-hmm.
a belief in the power of change, and a commitment to creating a more equitable future for everyone in STEM.
But this research also presents a challenge. Are you reflecting these same values in your own language? Think about the words you use, the assumptions you make, the stereotypes you might unconsciously perpetuate.
It's a call to action, to be mindful of the power of language
Yeah,
and to use it to build a more inclusive and equitable world.
well said. This deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about. Now, before we wrap things up, there's one more fascinating nugget from the research that I wanted to share.
Right.
It has to do with how this whole conversation around the STEM gender gap plays out differently depending on where you look.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So the researchers actually compared the TFMN analysis of Twitter
Right.
to a similar analysis done on a corpus of scientific papers.
Okay.
What they found was quite striking.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The language used in scientific papers was actually less positive
Really?
and hopeful than the language on Twitter.
Indeed. While the academic discourse tended to focus on the problems and challenges associated with the STEM gender gap. The social media conversation was more forward-looking,
Interesting.
emphasizing solutions and possibilities.
It's almost as if the scientific community is still debating the issue.
Yeah,
While out in the real world, people are already rolling up their sleeves and working towards solutions.
that's a great way to put it.
Right.
This difference in tone could be due to a number of factors.
Like what?
Perhaps social media, by its very nature, allows for a faster evolution of ideas. Or maybe it's because social media empowers those who are directly affected by an issue to drive the conversation.
It's a powerful reminder that change often happens from the bottom up.
It is.
The energy and momentum for progress often
Yeah.
come from those who are closest to the problem.
Absolutely. And social media provides a platform for those voices to be amplified, for people who are passionate about making a difference,
Yeah.
to connect and create a sense of collective purpose.
It's inspiring to see that even in the face of complex challenges, there's this underlying current of optimism and a belief that we can create a better future.
Right.
And it's happening right now online in real time through the power of language.
It's a testament to human resilience and our capacity for innovation and collective action.
Yeah.
It reminds us that we have the power to shape our own future, and that even small actions, like changing the way we talk about an issue, can make a big difference.
Beautifully put. This deep dive has truly been a journey of discovery. hasn't it?
Yes.
We started with some basic stats about the STEM gender gap,
Yeah.
but we ended up exploring so much more. The complexities of human perception,
Right.
the power of language to shape reality, and the potential for social media to be a catalyst for positive change. What stands out to you most from this exploration?
For me, it's that reminder that language isn't just a passive tool for describing reality.
Right.
It's an active force that shapes our perceptions,
Yeah.
our beliefs, and even our actions.
It really makes you think about the responsibility we all have when we communicate.
It does.
Right. It's like we're all contributing to this ongoing narrative about the world. And by choosing our words carefully,
Right.
we can help shape that narrative in a more positive and inclusive direction.
Exactly. By challenging harmful stereotypes, amplifying positive messages,
Yeah.
and just being mindful of the assumptions embedded in our language, we can contribute to a more just and equitable world.
It's empowering to realize that we all have that power.
It is.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me.
Yeah.
We started with some basic statistics about the STEM gender gap, but we ended up exploring so much more. The complexities of human perception,
Right.
the power of language to shape reality, and the potential for social media to be a catalyst for positive change.
And what's particularly fascinating is that this potential for change isn't limited to grand pronouncements or formal campaigns.
Right.
It's happening every day in the seemingly mundane interactions we have online.
It's like those small acts of kindness that ripple outward and create a more positive environment. Except in this case, it's the words we choose, the perspectives we share, and the narratives we challenge that have the power to create those ripples.
Precisely so. As we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I want to leave you with this thought.
Okay.
What kind of world do you want to create with your words? What stories will you tell?
Yeah.
What changes will you inspire?
That's a great question to ponder. And until next time, keep diving deep.